for on the employee compensation recommendation from the governor's letter and kind of clarify some of the issues that we came up when we were working the budget bill. So Drew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Appreciate your additional time today. What we wanted to do was just come back and review with you after the final action you took during the first in December with respect to employee compensation. We met earlier this week and thanks Representative Stith and Don Richards for meeting with us and going through that. So we wanted to make sure that we understood the motion that was made. And so with that, we wanted to do two things with your permission, Mr. Chairman. Now was kind of go through and show you what the result of your motion would look like if it was applied as it was made and as it was intended to be made. And then we'd also, the other thing we wanted to do is show you what would do that if the amounts that we would need for a one-year raise to go where we would hope to be, and then answer any questions you might have. So with your permission, Mr. Chairman, so as we understood the motion, it was basically an 8% a motion and understanding this clarification with Representative Stith. His intent in the motion, as was modified by Senator Hicks, who was on the Senate Appropriations Committee at the time, was it was intended to be a motion that would be a fixed dollar amount of roughly $35.5 million. In doing that, we did a little rounding. I don't know if $160,000 is in the noise, but ultimately in looking at that and kind of running it back through our formula about how that would be applied, and that's what you'll see at the top of this memo that we sent out. It should be dated January 12th of 2023 from our office. And so the JAC appropriation was roughly $35.5 million. When it comes down to the state agencies and how this works across state agencies, that would be roughly $28 million to state agencies. We have to back out the variable costs associated with fringe benefits, which would leave to apply to salaries. As you see, they're just about $20.5 million. The way that would be applied under the current formula is we would end up with applying vacancies in base pay and variable benefits to vacancies that would probably still leave them at about 83% of MPP, which would be about 4.1 million. That would leave then a base salary for current employees of about 12 million, and base benefits for current base plus benefits for current employees then would be about 16.3 million when you load that up with that. That would result in, and since you were talking about it in the context of average raises per employee, that would be about an average raise of about 4.7% for employees for that second biennium of the year, and result in about an average compensation ratio across all classifications of jobs of roughly about, we'd be at about just under 95% of MPP of market for 2022. Some information that we wanted to give with you is that we checked our vacancy rate, and the vacancy rate without temporary workforce was about 1,350 employees in the state of Wyoming. So those would be permanent employees, permanent positions. About 1,350 of those at the end of 9/30. When you add the vacancies at 12/30 of 2022, just last month, that's now at about 1,400. If you add in the AWECs that have expired, that's about almost 1,800, just under 1,800 with temporary workforce. There's about a number of about 300 in there, but ultimately we continue to see, even with 14, that still leaves us at about a 20% vacancy rate across the state with base employees. I think if you want, and then going down to this, I'll just pause there, Mr. Chairman, and see if there are any particular questions about that.
Questions? Senator Guerrero.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief, I just want to make sure I got it. So across the enterprise, a 20% vacancy rate or turnover rate, probably I guess would be the best way to characterize that. Or maybe not. You tell me.
I think you're right the first time. I
Okay,
think the
vacancy
vacancy
rate.
rate is about 20%. There's about 7,500 permanent employees across the state, and we're at about 1,400. Like I say, there were about 300 AWAC contracts that expired at the end of December. And so the AWAC, the at-will employees under contract are not included in these numbers. And so that's why we have that qualifier on there without temporary workforce. So they're also down, like I say, about a little over 300 at-will employee contracts have expired.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so again, and I'll just go, just in the sake of hopefully moving along. So the goal of the governor in trying to do this second phase was in the second phase of the employee compensation program that we started last year. The intent was to move, again, vacancies to try and help recruitment, to move them to 90% of MPP, and then continue to try and move our compensation ratio towards 100% of market for our employees. To do that would require a total enterprise appropriation of $48 million, which is about 15 million more than was allocated in the original motion. That appropriation to state agencies net of benefits would be about $8 million. And if we do that, we could give it basically the matrix average, we could give our employees about an 8% raise. And at the same time, then our proposal would also be that you would give us a modest deviation from the 310, section 310 in the budget section, to use 100 series money to go ahead and then fund vacancies to move that up to 90%. That would be roughly $8 million.
Drew, could you, oh, no, go ahead. Yeah.
Did you say moving 900 up 100?
No, it would just, we have enough, there's enough vacancy savings across the enterprise because of the vacancies. It's just a variance to move 100 to 100. If you remember in our chapter 17 reconciliations, that's always a very sore point with the Joint Appropriations Committee when that happens. And so we're coming to ask, in the olden days, they would be called indulgences, and this will just call it a modest variance from this section 300. And the benefit is that with the vacancy rate, obviously you've already appropriated significant amounts of money into Series 100 that's going to revert at one point or another. And so there's, if you allow us to use some of that, then you wouldn't necessarily have additional appropriation. I think the benefit of that is if you appropriate and let it revert, it ends up in the LSRA 6 to 9 months later. If it's not appropriated, and we were to do that, the money that you're not appropriating to cover those types of things would end up in the LSRA faster on the sweep at the end of the biennium.
Drew, can you explain what the average compa ratio is versus your MMP? Because those percentages are close, but they're not the same. I just want people to understand what that is.
I'm going to let someone who knows more about that explain that. You want to? Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry. Who's it going to be? Is it Aaron or is it going to be? I have Megan. What did you get the short straw?
I did.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, to answer your question, the MPP is the market rate. So we're looking at,
To go to market rate, that goes back to the regional states that you consider establishing the market rate. Is that accurate?
yes, Mr. Chairman.
And did you do an analysis with different, taking out the high dollar states?
Mr. Chairman, I was able to give you a chart with some state comparator government pay data that showed our contiguous states and our comparator states without that. However, running a full market analysis does take me a little over a month and a half to rework all of that and make sure we have a valid model based on.
Can you pull your microphone a little closer?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
A little closer.
All right, I'm sorry. So to ensure we had to have a valid model and that we're using valid economic indicators, a full model was not rerun. We had time constraints, making
Sure.
sure we have a valid model to present to you. I did show you some averages using contiguous states and then removing any state that was not a contiguous state
So
in our memo.
is that,
That's on page 2 of that memo. That you-
Okay.
Yes, sir.
so can you go to page 2 and tell us what, I mean, can we see, is there an impact by logically just by removing Oregon or?
In my opinion, the impact is
Hmm?
minimal, in my opinion. But I did provide that for you.
Okay. So go ahead. I'm sorry. Go back to the question. I sidetracked you. Sorry.
Explaining the MPP is the market rate. To get a compa ratio, you take actual pay divided by the market rate, and that shows you how close you are to the market. So a compa ratio of 97.8 shows that we are paying approximately 97.8% of the market rate.
Of the market rate.
Sorry, Representative.
Okay, so the average compa ratio is a percentage to MMP.
MPP, yes, the market rate.
All right, that helps. All right, thank you.
And so anyway, at the end of the day, you see that we would become closer. So with that, if we were able, if with basically 15 million more dollars and a variance from the from 310 of about $8 to $9 million, we could if you go to the top page of 2, that's about where we would get. We would get to roughly another between 7% and 8% average raise for state employees. And then we also see the 8 million increase to vacancies that we could use that to get to 90. So ultimately that ends up being the result. And you see that the end down below and where we would end up if that were to happen. And of course, I think then the next of these charts, and the intent of this is to kind of show you, this was supposed to be the whole effort was we started this, the governor proposed it a year ago, that we did phase 1, which had been after the budget, and then the phase 2 would be the action that's taken this time, if any action is taken by the legislature in doing this. So we broke this down and looking at these compa ratios. Now that you understand what that is, we've broken it down to 4 categories: who's less than 90, 90 to 100, 100 to 110, and over 110, where we would be. And if you look at the second column after phase 1, and it's also important to know the other thing that happened last year that takes additional money is we moved from the 2017 market, or excuse me, the 2020 market. We're moving up to the 2022 market. And so you're looking at those market averages and trying to get that. So as you can imagine, the target continues to change in employee compensation because inflation and other things happen that move those up. So there's 2 things that happen. So what we're trying to show in phase 1 is if the legislature took no action, where we would be after phase 1. And you can see that out of 7,500 employee positions, you would have almost 5,600 would still be at below 90% of market compared. If no action was taken, we basically have more than two thirds of our entire state employees would be under 90% of the market average. You
So-
see the differences in there.
Sorry for interrupting. So we had discussions earlier this morning about the first pay raise, and I think Representative Stiff articulated that you gave vacancies roughly a 3% pay raise in order to give a larger pay raise to overall. And so I just want to understand that. And so then part of what you need to do is bring those vacancy rates up above or to a different MMP or compa rate. as part of this process. Is that fair?
Well, right, if you, yes, Mr. Chairman, yeah, but if I can add just a little bit to flesh that out. So what, if you remember there's two elements. That one was just what do you do with the wage classification? And so what we did with the wage what we do with the wage classification, and if I get this wrong, Megan, slap me. And so we gave a 3% across, we gave a 3% increase across on each classification. So the base salary, I went 3%. That included not only filled positions, but vacant positions. Is that correct? What's that? Excuse me. That was my correction, just vacancy. So then the rest of it was, and the concentration is last year was to try and enhance retention because we're bleeding employees. So to try and enhance retention, then though the filled positions, then we're given, there was also an adjustment to begin to move to market. And then the rest of it was based upon their MPI. And their MPI is their employee rating. And so if you got a meets expectations or superior, you got a higher raise, a merit increase as opposed to those who didn't. And so that's the difference. That's where the application goes. So there's adjustments in categories, but then the major adjustments were made based upon merit and the MPIs.
And so the total pay raise for 2022, was it 7.3 or was it 8.5? I mean, on average for the.
I think go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, that number was 7.9.
7.9.
Yes, sir.
And what was the dollar figure for those?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that the overall that was given to state employees was the 37.2.
Go.
37.2. And so in terms of the biennialization of that number, will it be 37.2 that is biennialized? Is that correct? Because what I want to get to is with ultimately, if we do this next raise, then what the compounded biennialization will cost will be for, go ahead, Kevin.
Mr. Chairman, the appropriation for salaries last year was a biennial because we started at the beginning of the biennium. The appropriation that we're discussing now would be for the
15 months
2024 now, and then that would be double for 25, 26.
So the 37.2 is a biennialized number.
That's correct, for state agencies.
And the 48 million, I think that's the number, right?
Is enterprise for 2024. So that includes the $28 million for the state agencies and then the University of Wyoming Community Colleges, et cetera.
And that number will biennial.
That's correct.
So you'll have 37.2 plus the 96.
37. Well, if you look at this from an enterprise perspective, because the $37 million is for the state agencies. So let's make sure that we're either talking about the state agencies alone or the enterprise itself. The enterprise number was about $65 million.
That's the number I want.
Yeah. And then what you'll do is you'll have a 97.7 million if you biannualize the 48,850. That's what'll be the total in 25, 26.
97.7.
Yeah. So right now, the governor's recommendation for 2024 of the second round of compensation for the enterprise is 48,850. That would biannualize to 97,700, and that's for all entities.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So I have a question about this extra $8 million, because at the top of page 2, and then also in your column chart, the 5th column over, there's a distinction between the governor's initial request and the revised request. And it makes it look like that you're not asking for 48 million. It makes it look like you're asking for 56 million, but I may be misreading that.
Mr. Chairman, if I could add some value, please. The $48 million is an ask for an appropriation, clear and simple. The $8 million is simply flexibility out of existing appropriations. We're not asking for an
Right.
additional, we're just asking for the ability to use vacancy savings.
That's
If
the
you
vacancy
recall, we reverted $45 million.
And so but then on that particular issue, are you likely to request that flex for ongoing costs?
Mr. Chairman, at this point in time, in the environment that we're in, we would continue that process. Once we come out of the environment that we're in, then we would probably adjust the budgets. But we will keep track of this in specificity in the Chapter 17 report with a particular column by position, by agency, by division, by unit.
And so then, Don, at ultimately, as we walk through this, we're going to need, I think you've done it, but we're going to need the long-term scenario up to the budget with these amounts in that 162 a biennium. I mean, because you did that forecast in December. We need to revisit that, I think, just so we understand the impacts. Just one second. Tim, I already gave it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Perkins, if we allowed for that flexibility within section 310, then those employees would have a higher rate of pay. How will that affect the next biennium budget as we pay them at their new pay scale, pay rate, and then also come back in and want to pay what were vacant but are now filled positions? How is this going to impact the overall enterprise, or at least the state side of the enterprise, if we're using vacancy to increase the pay and then we fill those vacancies because they're going to need their full pay, and the employee that got the vacancy bonus or bonus because of the vacancy is going to now have a higher pay scale? They are going to hope to maintain that. So again, how does it affect the overall state side of the enterprise anyhow?
I think, the question is pretty obvious. If you pay people more going forward, you're going to pay people more. I think two things I think to keep in mind is, one is that if someone is meeting expectations or superior, you would want them to be at 100% of market. If they're not, it would be less. So the other side of it is, then particularly with permanent employees, we hire them, they have a probationary period. I think what you're looking at is you would not anticipate that directors and new employees would always be hired at MPP. They would be hired at, and if the vacancy's there, and that's one of the reasons to move the vacancies to 90%, is that you would hire them, and that's typically been the practice, is to hire people at that lower echelon, so that after a year they can move in, and you have the ability to potentially give some increase to them after they complete their probationary period. So just because the anticipation is that there'll be many of your new hires would not be at full MPP because they have not been evaluated yet and have not gone through their probationary period.
I think a good way to answer the question is, let's assume that we don't give you the flex. And then we would anticipate getting $8 million back. You guys came up with that number. And if that's the case, then the net effect of that would be the raises that you would give would be slightly smaller than if you didn't in 2023. Is that fair?
I think that's right. Your raises, you go back to do that, and all of a sudden the raises now are more like 6% instead of 8%. And of course, the problem, we all know that. I just read an article last week in the Wall Street Journal. It took, at least this is on a national basis, certainly not on a Wyoming basis, but they took and examined inflation across. They divided all income levels in the United States into 10 segments. So from the very, those who make modest wages, those who are very rich, and they said across those decennial segments of income, what was the inflation rate? Nobody was below 15%. And so in this process, as you move, the more that you don't provide in raises now puts state employees that much further behind. And so if you don't provide, and quite frankly, even if you did this tomorrow, you're not going to have 1,700, 1,400 vacancies filled in a week or a month. We'll see what happens going forward, but you're not going to have all those filled. So getting, at the end of the day, I think what you're looking at is the point this now is how do we continue to retain employees by trying to keep them at and continue to move them towards market in a significant way. And then also, how do you get the vacancies high enough so that you can offer a wage that is reasonably attractive to someone? And and as you look, there are lots of reasons why people take jobs and lots of reasons why people leave jobs. But one of the main factors is money. And until you resolve that problem to some degree, the rest of the factors are distant second.
Tim, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm new. I'm just trying to pick all this up. You mentioned in 22, the increase was 7.9. Is that correct? With a dollar amount of 37.2. Is that correct? And then in the next phase, 2023, 24, can you give me those two numbers again as far as the percentage and the dollar amount then?
If I can just clarify.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I apologize. And I'm just looking for the state agencies, not the enterprise number.
So if I just can clarify, Mr. Chairman, so and again, is that to move to 8%, what the state agency number would be?
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, that number is the appropriate state agencies would be 28 plus.
So for the, are you doing?
With,
Are you wanting
which for salary only would be 28 million. And if you add the benefits, it would be roughly a fourth, it'd be another 7,300,000 on top of that. So it'll be 35, 35.5, somewhere in there.
35.5. And then, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up, again, the percentage would be 8% then? Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we go back to your handout, Chief Perkins, you discussed the JAC action. Those numbers were based on a July 1 starting date, I believe. Are your numbers based on a July 1 starting date?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So, Mr. Chief of Staff, trying to sort out the difference between the governor's initial request and the revised request. Under the initial request, if I understand it, the vacancies would have been left at 83% of parity. Under the revised request, the vacancies come up to 90%. Because I think.
That's a not, Mr. Chairman, that's a yes.
Thank you.
Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have two questions. One has to do with your assessment, if you'd like, of the impact, hopefully positive, of the last, the phase 1 pay raise. And then the other one, I mean, we talk about all these vacancies, but is it fair to say that the key positions have been identified? And if so, how many vacant key positions are we looking at in the state?
I don't know. I don't know that we identify who's key and who's not key. I think in the real world, you may have a clerical worker that keeps the entire office together, who that may be the most key person in that office, and other places that may be the director, or somebody anywhere in between. So it's hard to identify who's a key position. We do identify who are and can share with you information about who's an essential worker. And we also have identified individuals who are what we call mission critical workers. We can certainly share those positions with you as well. I think we can do that. We know who that is.
Mr. Chairman, and then just a sort of an assessment, if you will, of the positive effect from the phase one is kind of overall. I mean, has there been areas where this has had a very positive effect and turnover has slowed? That kind of.
I think that anecdotally, it kind of depends who you talk to, but I think overall, I can tell you this from as an anecdote. So in my first month in the job, I interviewed or had a one-on-one. I didn't with whatever you want to call it. It was a one-on-one meeting, a short meeting with most of the directors across the enterprise, with the exception of the boards and commissions. And so there's about 20 some directors, and generally it was very helpful. It made a difference to give an average raise across the enterprise of 8%. And we can go more into it, but there was an emphasis to bring lower paid individuals up significantly, and that did occur, and that's made a difference. It's always obviously the problem when you have an across the board raise. If you just give it across the board raise, if you're a snowplow driver making $19 and you get a 10% raise, there's $1.90 an hour extra, maybe that'll pay for part of your next tank of gas. And so of course people to hire. And so you'll see that there was a progressive rate where we tried to bring lower people up, and we're committed to do that same thing again, to try and bring the lower people up higher, because just straight percentage allocations and straight across the board raises it continues to leave the people who are at the low end of the page scale down. On the other hand, you still have to be careful because you have to manage wage compression. And it's tricky to manage the vacancies and how you fund vacancies, because if you run all your vacancies, if you increase your vacancies and don't move your filled positions up, you end up with wage compression, or end up with the situation where you have new people who have been there with no experience are being paid more than people who've been there 2 or 3 or 4 years. And then you start at musical chairs among the agencies as everybody seeks a higher wage through employment. So there's lots of things to manage in these programs as we move forward, but we're trying to make sure that we treat people fairly, that recognize the value that they give, and then also importantly, the performance that they give and the effort and the results they get on each of their jobs.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
at the risk of asking one question too many, or maybe several too many,
Trying to correct me.
to bring the vacancies from 83 to 90%, as you're proposing, to bring the vacancies from 83% to 90% of market, just on a gross basis, that's for them, that's an 8.6% increase, right? From where they are. Is that as a percentage of the whole pot, is it about that same amount that we're giving to the vacancies? If you see what I mean? I mean, how are the vacant? Question really is, how are the vacancies distributed? Are the vacancies distributed randomly through the pay scale? If they are, then 8.6% would be 8.6%. But if, for example, the vacancies tended to be at the lower end of the pay scale, it would take less money to bring them from 83 to 90. Whereas if your vacancies tend to be concentrated in the higher levels of people making lots of money, then to raise them up 8.6% would take more than 8.6%, would take a higher proportion of the money, if you know.
I'll phone a friend and call our statistician from ANI if we may, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, when we move the vacancies to 83% of MPP and then to move them again to 90, that's a set dollar amount based off of the market rate. And so depending on where those positions are funded right now, it might not be 8% to every position.
And Mr. Chairman, my question is it more, is it less, just qualitatively speaking, if you know, and you may not know.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, I don't feel comfortable answering that without some more data in front of me.
And that's how statisticians roll.
Okay, further questions?
And Mr. Chairman, if I'll just continue up, just about done, and thank you for your time today. The last couple of pages 3 and 4, we just gave you some examples of how this has worked in some various wage categories that may be of some interest. So you have the highway maintenance workers, which I believe includes snowplow drivers. And so you can see again how after the phase one, what that's done, how that's worked and what their average percentages were, and again, how that would work. Again, then page 4 was social services workers. I can tell you that one of the great frustrations social services workers talking with Director Schmidt is she has a lot of these folks that are still down, and you can see, and I think it's borne out in the ratio there. They still struggle to have a living wage among a lot of the caseworkers that are out there. And then just office support specialists, which are, I think that's your medium, that's your entry level or high level. That's your entry level support position, clerical staff position, and the effects on them there. It's interesting to go across the enterprise. It's just sometimes you look, if you go back and stare through this booklet time to time and find some of the classifications and look at them, you would wonder why in the world someone would come and do the jobs that are inquired in that for the amount that were offered. I just, and you see it. I mean, whether it's a correctional office, whether it's a snowplow driver, whether it's someone who's working at the boys' home in Warland, sometimes you look at those starting wages, you wonder why in the world someone would come and do that job for that when, and you've all seen, everybody knows the stories about, everybody's got them in your private businesses, everybody got them in your communities, and maybe in your own businesses that you're seeing these same things. And it's just, as you can see, it's a significant problem in state government. So I think that's what we have for you this morning.
So I wanted to follow up now. I had a chance to look at A&I's report. So it says that they took out Texas, California, Florida, and Michigan in their analyses. And that was done by the Employee Compensation Commission. And I believe I was on the commission when we did that, if my recollection serves me right. But I'm no longer. But I remember I made that recommendation like 3 years ago when I was serving on this commission. But what do we know what the effect does when we did that? I mean, how that changed the numbers for comparators, and was it? Do we know? I'm just curious.
Mr. Chairman, I was not here at that time, so I can't speak to those effects. Director Bach, would you like to take that?
Yeah, it was your fault.
Thank you, Chairman, Co-Chair, and members. My name is Patricia Bach, Director with the A&I. I do remember us talking about this in the last few years, but what is being referenced here is something that was taken out years ago. When we spoke, if I remember correctly, I think the concern was Washington and Oregon.
I think that's right.
Yeah. So I think that if you look at the table on the second page, it does show the contiguous states average, which I think is what you would like to see more of. So I think that is helpful for your request. The problem with taking out Washington and Oregon and doing a matrix and a market again would be months worth of work to try to figure out what that number would be. But this is kind of a quick snapshot that we can get you.
Okay.
And Chairman Nicholas, Director Bach is absolutely correct. When we implemented these 12 states, it was back in 2015 with the Hay study. There was a lot of analysis done at the time. And when we did the source and destination, actually California is one that showed up in our number, and it was extremely high. So we had Colorado and California kind of driving it. And so that was when the decision was made to add Washington and Oregon. And then we added in some lower paying states to kind of balance out the higher paying. And so we added Kansas, we had North Dakota, South Dakota. So they tried to get some high paying and some low paying in the source and destination. In the past, it was California and Colorado that drove it.
So wouldn't it be fair to say that Colorado, Oregon, and Washington are probably driving it now? I mean, just logically. They just are. So could you recap so that just the ultimate components, and I want Mr. Co-Chair to kind of hear these numbers and everyone else make sure that we got the right numbers.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, if you kind of go back, I think you can find the recap on the first, on page 1 to the top of page 2. That with the result of the action that JAC took in December would result in what you see kind of in the middle of page 1, that there's the JAC enterprise appropriation roughly of 35, just a little over $35.5 million. The appropriation of state agencies net of benefits then would be $20 million. Then you see the breakdown below of how that goes. We would move vacancies and base pay on variable benefits would apply 4.1 million of that. Unfortunately, it doesn't move the percent of MPP very much with respect to vacancies. We still be about 83% of MPP for vacancies. That would leave about 12 million or 16.3 million then left for base salary and benefits for current employees. That would ultimately result in then a raise of about 4.7% to employees in filled positions. And you would still be at only 83% in vacancies.
So if the intent was, I mean, part of the discussion that I recall is we said, well, let's, instead of giving them a complete bump, 8% in 1 year, so that they'll have a 7.9% bump in 2022 and then an 8% in 2023. At least I think I remember part of the conversation being, why don't we just give them 4% in 2023 and plan on giving them another 4% in 2024 to kind of spread it out. And yeah, just because we may go into a recession, something may happen that we might have to do this in a little slower fashion. And so did you hear that on the tapes when you listened to these magical tapes?
So I did go back and listen to the tape about 4 times, and I think there was some confusion among the executive and then my individual conversations with members of this committee. There was confusion on this committee about exactly what that action resulted in. Again, I went back to the original mover to find out what his intent was. And so going off that, and as it was modified by Senator Hicks to move that back to 1 year, that's where we went and used roughly the number that when Representative Stith goes, that'd be roughly 35. And he does this, he is 35.5. So this is the equivalent of 36,660 anyway, if we do that. But I think that if you do that, again, what you have is, I think and no one knows that better than this committee, Mr. Chairman, that you've got $6 to $7 trillion waiting to come into play just from federal sources. You've just finished deploying CARES Act money. You are now just in the process of now starting to deploy ARPA money. That's just now hitting the system. So that's about 3 trillion, 2.5 odd trillion. You've got IDGA money coming right down the pike behind that over the next several years, which is another 2.5 to 3 trillion, which is a lot of money to the state of Wyoming as well. And then right behind that, you've got the Inflation Reduction Act, which is about another trillion, not quite another $1 trillion. So you have $7-8 trillion just of federal money that's going to come into construction and other sources the next little while. Now, it's like it's not just supply chain issues, it's employment issues. We all know what employment issues are, and that's going to continue to drive that. So I don't know that inflation is going anywhere for a while. I think we're starting to see some tempering of inflation at this point, but it's not, I don't think we're going to see it all go away. So back to your specific question, Mr. Chairman, if you just make modest moves now, whatever I don't know that anybody's going to turn down a 4% raise, but we continue to lose ground on where we are against the market and how it's going to proceed forward. That just makes it all the harder to fill these positions. I think that you would see, I don't know that we would stem the vacancy rate. In fact, I think that there's a substantial, we still continue to find the employment. I mean, if you go back, I'm going to retirement committees of key people. I'm going to the retirement celebrations or farewells, going there. We still have the baby boom as we watch those people beginning and moving into retirement. I don't think if we don't make some moves to stem this, I don't think that we'll stem the vacancies. I think we'll only see them increase.
Okay, appreciate it. Further questions for Drew? Any further questions? All right. We got the tiger by the tail now. Thank you very much. We appreciate getting the
Thank you.
explanation. Go ahead.
Before we lose off, what's our next action? I was just wondering if we could get her to, I think we had a question out to you and give us a little bit of stuff on security. You kind of left the question out there on how much security that appropriation would take to the Capitol on the weekends. Right?
Thank you, Chairman, Co-Chair, Representative Larson. I do have the information for that on what we would need, and I don't have it with me, so I'm going to go off the top of my head. I discussed it this morning again with the General Services Division Administrator. What's difficult is to determine the utilities. That's the hardest part. We can figure out how many people we need. We're thinking we need probably 9 positions. That would be 2 custodians and a lead for the weekend, and this is Saturday and Sunday. We would need 2 people in buildings and grounds for various issues that come up on the weekend. We would need, right now, we're estimating 3 for trades. If something goes wrong, HVAC, we would need somebody for that, electric, plumbing. So we were looking at the positions. The problem with utilities is that the Herscher building and the Capitol are together. So we're trying to figure out, right now, there's not a way to shut down Herschler from the connector on. But I'm not sure how much that would be for Saturday and Sunday.
So wait a minute. Why can't you just lock the door?
I'm sorry, with utilities. So they're all on the same system. So if we're keeping the utilities for the Capitol on and running at the normal, cooling in the summer, heating in the winter, we normally drop it down on the weekends. So we save some money. We can't do that between Herschler and right now. We don't think we can do that because they're connected.
So why in the world would that not have been addressed in the process of construction? Just interesting.
Chairman, it's a good question. It doesn't mean that we can't get somebody in here to figure out how to do it. It's just right now, quickly trying to figure out how to do it. They would both be on. I don't know that that's going to be a huge increase. It could be. So when we looked at having the positions roughly are about 1.4 million. It was kind of ironic because that's about what we gave back in the positions for HRD. So I do have more information and I'm sure I can get more, but it is feasible. We looked at all the different states and if they're open, it's about a 50-50 split.
So is Division O on site through the weekend here?
Division O is not, and we've been working with Division O. SecOps is down in the cup during the Saturday and Sunday and in the evenings. The
So they're
same,
on site.
they are. My understanding is they are. So GSD and Division O have been working pretty closely trying to figure this out. So it is feasible. We would have to staff it though. So the way we looked at it is maybe because we wouldn't want to. I know that there was a question of Memorial Day through Labor Day. That would be almost more difficult than just keeping it open year round. We would have to have part-time folks and then we'd have to lay them off. I would rather not have to have that type of a situation. So if you had it year round, even just on Saturday or Saturday and Sunday, we can certainly do that and we would not have them sitting around either. So they would be able to be in the Capitol Square, catch up on stuff that the people during the week weren't able to do. So we've talked about that, having somebody come in 4/10s, 5 Friday through Monday.
Well, and one of the other issues would be, I think, particularly in the summers, having it open longer. So it's just not 8 to 5.
Having it open, I'm sorry.
Longer, because lots of people are out and about at 5 o'clock, whereas now it's dark. And then it's pleasant, so people can stay later as well. So as you do these computations, I think you need to think of all the variables, to maximize the use of this building. And when we did the capital, the capital working group, one of the thoughts was that this would become partly a civic building, so that if the city of Cheyenne wanted to use the auditorium or wanted to have conference rooms available, or for any other civic groups, that they could register for it, and then they could use it in the evenings. And figure out a way that, you could give them keys or whatever there it is for that to happen. But just to make it a public building more than it currently is.
Chairman Nicholas, I remember that conversation as well. And the first thing I thought of is having, the Wyoming State Bar meet downstairs and have those meetings rooms for breakout sessions. And it does make sense. I know that was the intent, or at least a few people's intent, to have that be a possibility, and it could work that way. We could also work it to where it's open in the evening, off and on, depending on what's going on. So we are prepared to talk about that as well.
Mr. Chairman. Okay, go ahead.
So Director Balk, I will confess a little bit of surprise. Just, my recollection of the conversation was you had submitted in your budget some security requests for the Emerson, some of the other buildings in this building and in that conversation, we really, I think we said we wasn't concerned about the other buildings and ask about the rest of the state, but what we did want to do was to try and keep this open. And I guess I assumed that we would probably come back with some security requirements in this proposal. And now we've got to have custodians, we've got to have groundskeepers, we've got to have the tradesmen. And I'm not understanding why that is. I think we see, maybe on a limited degree, but I don't know. I guess I'm a little surprised that all of a sudden we need as many support personnel to keep it open on. So walk me through that and help me understand why that's, and then why that's caught me a little by surprise, I guess.
Sure. Chairman Nicholas, Representative Larson, we need to have custodial staff on board for any incident that could happen. We have to have snow removal available on the weekends. We don't currently, for example, if there's a big snowstorm that hits on Saturday, our staff comes out and looks at it and sees how it is, but we make sure it's ready for Monday. We don't have to worry about the buildings on the weekends as much as we worry about them during the week. We can't have folks in here, eating, trash. There's a lot that goes on in what the custodians do. If we're going to have it open, the word will get out that it's open and people will come down here. I do believe people will come down here on the weekends. We have to have the staff to be able to make it look like it's supposed to look and take care of it. The trades are the ones that I could see being a little bit of a surprise because we went back and forth on that. But if something happens on Saturday with the HVAC system, we need to have somebody on staff that's available right now to come take care of it. So in that discussion, we've gone back and forth a little bit. We did with the buildings and grounds, because if it's not snowing, what are they doing? So if you've been around on Mondays, that's grass cutting day in the summer and it's loud. If you're on the first floor and in one of those conference rooms, it's very loud. Maybe we switch grass cutting on the Capitol to Sunday. Those are the things that we're thinking about, trying to utilize it so that it's open and it's the way it should look and it's taken care of the way it should be, and utilizing the folks so they're not just standing around.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, you brought up something that now has me pondering. If it's closed and something happens on the weekend with the HVAC system, somebody comes in over the weekend and gets it ready for Monday. So if it's open and something happens, how is that any different? Whether there's the general public wandering through here, and I'm not referring to the good chairman's idea of having a community meetings, et cetera. I'm just simply from a come view the Capitol standpoint, people touring the Capitol, whether it's HVAC, plumbing, whatever, if something happens closed or open, someone's going to have to take care of that over the weekend, so it's ready for Monday. So why would that now all of a sudden become a new expense to keep it open on the weekends? That's currently being handled. I guess I just can't track that line of reasoning.
Chairman Nicholas, Representative Walters, there's a difference between being on call and getting here eventually to take care of a non-essential issue versus if we're in the middle of summer and the HVAC goes out and AC goes out and it's hot in this building. Sometimes we might not know if this building is not open for a while to take care of it. If somebody's in this building, we need to make sure that we get it taken care of right away. That's what we were looking at. If it's an on-call situation, it takes a little longer for somebody to come in, see what's going on. Sometimes it takes a while for us to be notified that there's an issue. I instantly think to the leaking of the house chamber when we had all that snow. Those are the things that if that happened on a weekend, you know, or nobody was here, I worry about what would have happened with that water damage. So I think it's something we can work through if we look at it and say maybe there only needs to be one tradesperson around on the weekends, whether it's HVAC or a plumber or an electrician. We can go through that as well.
Mr. Chairman.
Mhm.
Thank you. So Director Bach, as we're getting ready for this supplemental budget, could you get that to us so we need to know so we can, if we're gonna fund it, we just need to know what that is.
Sure. Chairman Nicholas, Representative Larson, we can get that on paper for you before tomorrow.
And Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
if I may, Director Bach, so I understand the $1.4 million figure you gave, is that for one fiscal year or for a biennium?
Chairman Nicholas, I'm going to have to double check that number. I don't want to say that it's for a year. I think it's for the biennium, but I'm not quite sure.
I think about had to be because it was part of the budget.
I think it was too. So, but I will double check and we'll make sure it's clear on the email.
Okay, any other questions for Trish? Oh, I do. One comment. So during legislative session,
Mhm.
there are lots of meetings that start at 7 o'clock. The doors are locked. And so can we get that fixed?
Chairman Nicholas, that did happen on Tuesday. It's supposed to be open at 6:30. Was it the same today?
I didn't get here that early.
I believe it was fixed.
Okay,
And there was a miscommunication on Tuesday. However, that was fixed on
Okay.
Tuesday.
great.
If anybody has an issue, please call me.
Okay. Any issue?
We
Okay.
do already.
All right, thank you. Okay, with that, let's take a, no, let's just continue. Let's do CapCon, right? While I get a cup of coffee.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm going to walk through 23 LSO 0409, which is committee formal draft 1.0, the state-funded capital construction. This bill was broken out from the supplemental budget beginning in 2017 after the LSO legal memo response to the request from Management Council. This bill is different than the budget bill. The Constitution indicates that the budget bill is for the general operations of government and for public schools. Paraphrasing, the state construction bill can include K-12 capital construction. Currently, this version does not, and nor has it typically. It is subject to the single subject rule, however. And one alternative to the budget is you can amend statute and create statute within the text of the bill, unlike the budget bill in most cases. So this bill does both of those. On page 1, we have a explanation of the long title. Page 2, section 1 is the first creation of new statute. This creates a new account, the Wyoming State Hospital Demolition Account. This is also created in a footnote in the budget bill, but the ideal way to do this is in the text of a statute, it's what is being done in this bill draft. Section 2 is amending current statute, so it's in the strike and underline drafting process. Subsection G of Wyoming Statute 92-3006 appears at the top of page 3. This is language that was informed by the State Construction Department's budget request and specifically allows for escalation and de-escalation within contracts of the University of Wyoming, as well as the State Construction Division, which also oversees the construction projects at community colleges. You'll recall on lines 11 through 15, we took the language directly from the budget request, and that in no event shall the department, in this case, the Department of Construction, shall approve a contract that contains a material cost escalation factor less than 7.5% or greater than 30%.
You know, we have the state pen. There are buildings that we know in retirement centers that around the state that will need demolished. There are buildings here that may need demolished. And so I'm just curious if that makes more sense.
Mr. Chairman, of course, staff have no policy preference on this at all. We were just trying to incorporate the motion, which was specific. It certainly could be generic. And to your point, for example, there was a state facilities account, which really was the WLRC account, and it was limited to just that facility during construction. There was also the state building account, but it was really limited to the Thyra Thompson building. So you end up having these hanging accounts that have not been addressed, to your point.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
However, I think the intent of the state hospital demolition account was because we were using agency reversions, Department of Health reversions to take care of a facility that belonged to them. I think the danger, Mr. Chairman, and Don might be able to say it, is if we opened that up and said it was just a generic demolition account to be used for demolition activities, and you funded it with reversions intended to do something under that jurisdiction, it would perceivably then allow diversion of those funds to take care of a project that had no relationship to that department. It seems to me that perhaps upon completion of demolition, if there's leftover funds to then move those, does that make any sense, Don?
That's a yes or no question.
Generally, no, it doesn't make sense.
Mr. Chairman, I believe, Representative Larson, I believe that risk does have a potential. In this particular case, these are all general funds. they would have reverted to the general fund for any general operation of government purpose. So, but I certainly could see an example where you were using fire and electrical safety fees and use their reversions and then potentially using those on a penitentiary project.
All right, please proceed. Go ahead.
Another question on that front, Mr. Chairman. Would it be feasible to just put language in there saying that once all demolition is complete, the account closes and the money at that point in time reverts to the general fund, and that way it has an automatic yet rolling sunset being that of the completion date?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman, we could add that to the end of that. One question to be thinking about is who makes that determination, whether it's the state auditor or the state construction department or the beneficiary of this, the Department of Health, but upon certification of what entity might be thought, including in that sentence. Mr. Chairman, moving on to the top of page 4, there is a second subsection amended in this, and this is to refer to all inflationary costs going forward. And specifically that when the JAC appropriates funds for inflationary costs, that the scope of the project not be expanded. So this is again, new statute, which allows for any time in the future that the legislature elects to appropriate funds specifically for inflation, that they are limited to inflationary costs. The next revision relates on page 4 and 5 relates to the Ranch A account. And you'll recall this was a transfer of the Ranch A authority from this Board of Land Commissioners to the Department of State Parks. And because of that, there are several sections in existing statute as well as several appropriations that kind of need to be unwound and then relayed to a different department. So first of all, the Ranch A account, as defined on page 5, is under the jurisdiction of the Board of Land Commissioners. And you can see on lines 3 and 4, that has been changed to the State Parks and Cultural Resources Department, and then conforming language on lines 6, 7, and 10. And then very explicitly, a new subsection begins on lines 18 and 19 that designates the State Parks and Cultural Resources Department shall administer and operate, maintain Ranch A, again, shifting those responsibilities. Section 3 on page.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you bring, I guess, just myself up to date on what the goal is for this piece of property that we're talking about and why it's going to state parks? Are we going to turn it into a museum or a state park? And I apologize, I haven't heard the background history on it. I missed the last session.
Mr. Chairman, this was not a governor's request, so it was a change requested by the Joint Appropriations Committee. So I'm probably not the best to comment on what the long-term.
Thank you. That'll answer my question.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, does that fit in with the need for the bill? Kind of moves on to moving properties, not construction. Is that another subject?
Go ahead, Don.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's a great point. And just to give a quick preview, LSO legal staff does not opine in public anymore about the appropriateness of activities, but we do either meet informally with the chairs, not me, but the legal staff or the entire committee. And I think the chairman have requested such a meeting in the near future. On this issue here, what I can say is that property acquisition has historically, although we only have 5 years of examples, but has historically been included in the capital construction budget. And this is also tied to a specific appropriation, which will appear in section 4 for the maintenance and operation of that facility.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, section 3 on pages primarily 6 and 7 is boilerplate language, very similar to section 1 in the budget bill, defining funds, defining the purposes of an appropriation. But I would direct your attention to the top of page 7, where subsection B indicates that appropriations for capital construction, unlike appropriations for operations, shall remain in effect, meaning they do not revert until the project is completed. That's difference number 1. Number 2, the amounts appropriated for these projects shall not be transferred between projects, either between capital construction projects or taking CapCon monies and applying it to the operations of an agency. And then finally, all of the appropriations listed in this bill reflect the maximum price, not necessarily the amount that should be construed as a guarantee or an entitlement. Section 4, which really begins on the top of page 8 with all the substance, is indeed the meat of the bill. There are 2 subsections, or one subsection A, and it's broken into 2 parts. The first part appears in page 8, and the second part relating to the University of Wyoming appears on page 10, because there are 2 recipients of CapCon funds, school capital construction, or excuse me, the state capital construction department and the University of Wyoming. For purposes of state projects, beginning on line 11, you appropriated $51.4 million of general funds. This is $1.4 million over the governor's recommendation. You'll recall the governor asked for $50 million, and it is specifically designated for state facilities and community colleges that have been previously appropriated and have inflationary cost increases. So that definition of an inflationary cost would apply to this line 12, not for scope increases, but for material cost increases. Lines 13 and 14, the Joint Appropriations Committee concurred with the governor's recommendation of $7 million for a cost escalation and de-escalation fund. This appropriation is for new projects, not existing or historical projects, but the remaining projects in this list to the extent they are impacted negatively or adversely by inflation. Line 15 is a JAC addition. You'll recall at the very beginning of your December hearings, you had a presentation regarding the state fair projects, and you have agreed in your initial motions to appropriate $500,000 of general funds, which is matching requirement, and it is limited to capital construction projects identified in the first 1 to 3 years of the master plan at the state fair. Line 16 is a governor's recommendation, which the JAC concurred with, in the amount of $452,000 of general funds for a demolition of the Fort Washakie dormitory. That's at the state fairgrounds as well. Line 17 is the Ranch A, and that is $1 million of SIPA. And the direction there was to provide those funds to the state parks and cultural resources, and is the impetus for all of the other changes to the Ranch A statutes. This was a JAC addition. Line 20 is also a JAC addition to the budget bill. It includes footnote number 4. This appropriation is for demolition. This is an appropriation from the state hospital demolition account in the amount of $39.3 million. So you'll see the funds are reverted in the budget bill. They revert to this account in section 2, and then they're appropriated out of this account for the demolition.
John, you missed the office building.
Apologies, I did skip over 18 and 19. Lines 18 and 19 is also a JAC addition in the amount of $34 million general fund for purposes of a Riverton state office building. This was part of what I would describe a global motion, which included $70 million for the university as well on the page 10. Lines 21, 22, 23, and 24 are all governor's recommendations, which the committee concurred with for LCCC, Western Wyoming Community College, Eastern Wyoming Community College, and Northern Wyoming Community Colleges in the amounts requested. Line 25 is a JAC addition of $25,000 of general funds. It is also associated with footnote number 5. This provides for equal payments across 8 community colleges if they are designated as a military-friendly campus to have a display, memorial, or other designation of that achievement. And finally, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, on line 26, you concurred with the governor's recommendation for $3.9 million for the Department of Corrections Women's Center roof repair in Lusk. On page 9, there is footnote number 1, which is the language associated with the cost increases and designates which portion is attributable to community colleges and which portion is attributable to state facilities. Footnote number 2 requires a 5-to-1 match, or excuse me, a 1-to-3 match. I'm sorry, it is a 5-to-1 match for the first 3 years of the master plan feasibility projects at the state fair. Footnote number 3 is to be deposited into the Ranch A account and expended on the major maintenance and rehabilitation. Footnote number 4 is the demolition of the Wyoming State Hospital. And footnote number 5 is the military-friendly campuses. The amount for each college appears on the top of page 10, which is simply 25,000 divided by 8. The next paragraph discusses University of Wyoming projects. Starting off with line 14, there's an appropriation of $70 million designated for the UW dorms. And there is a lengthy footnote associated with that, specifically that this fund be used only after all other alternative project funding sources have been obligated or exhausted. And it can only be used for purposes of inflationary cost increases. And then subsection B indicates that upon completion and signing of this contract with the North and the South residence halls, subject to subsection C, then any unexpended, unobligated funds of this appropriation may be expended either on the west stands or the University War Memorial Stadium or the Nauditorium. And as a condition of this appropriation, further legislative action is required before the expenditure of funds relative to the Nauditorium or the War Memorial Stadium. Line 15, back on page 10, provides for $10 million of non-state funds, private funds for the AMK Ranch renovation. And the limitation on those funds appears in footnote number 2 and specifically prohibits the use of any state funds for this project. Finally, line 16, the UW Science Initiative was an addition by the Joint Appropriations Committee in the amount of $12.25 million of general funds. There is no footnote associated with that because it was part of the budget request, but denied by the governor. Section 5 is
Go ahead.
Before you move to that next one, Mr. Chairman, that AMK Ranch, is that the one north of Rock River? Or is that the one up by Gillette?
Mr. Chairman, this is in Teton National Park.
Oh.
So it's north of Jackson.
Oh.
If there's no further questions, section 5 is to effectuate the governor's recommendation to allow previously appropriated funds from 2021, adding one additional project for level 1, level 2 studies. In this case, the project would be the Wyoming Law Enforcement Academy. And I believe there's a locker, housekeeping, and storage units that are contemplated in that expansion.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, and again, maybe just to the newness of committee members, when we go about doing the level 1, level 2 studies in getting ready for projects, what we've been doing is identifying a number of projects that may be considered. And then we put aside funding that can be used in the level 1, level 2 studies will go as far as the funding will take us. But we're trying not to telegraph how much funding per level one, level two study, just trying to make sure that our bids are competitive and we're not telegraphing how much money is available. So that's why we kind of lump them together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you agree?
Yes. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just a couple more sections. Section 6 is the final effectuation of the transfer. It's called a type 1 transfer in statute of Ranch A obligations from OSLI and the State Land Board to the Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources. This ensures that any existing contracts, obligations, or unexpended funds in prior appropriations, of which there are some, they would transfer over to state parks and allow the state parks to use those funds. And it would not impair any of the contracts that are currently effectuated by the Office of State Lands. That is specified in section 7 on page 13. And of course, Mr. Chairman, the effective date is immediate on section 8, page 14.
Okay. Questions for Don? Seeing none? Anything else? I think that concludes our joint appropriations work for today. Okay, we'll stand adjourned until 8 o'clock tomorrow.